Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so thrilled that you have joined us here today for our second iteration of our Challenge Convention webinar series. This is a series that we are doing monthly here at MassChallenge to connect and convene around topics that matter and topics that are growing amongst the innovation community and to share learnings on a global scale. My name is Madison Sowards, and I am a community manager here at MassChallenge. And I am thrilled to be able to introduce this topic here with all of you today. We're here today to talk about advancing climate solutions on a global scale. This is an important topic for innovators and individuals alike. And we are going to hear today from a lot of really incredible speakers talking about what they are doing in the climate space, how we can enable and advance these climate solutions on a scale that's really going to make a difference. Climate tech, climate change solutions are all areas that we really need to be intentional about and advancing on a global scale to make that difference. And we have led conversations at MassChallenge about this before. There is a blog post that we actually recently published between Derek Warnick and MassChallenge CEO Kate Brummy. Feel free to check that out. We will throw that link in the chat. And that's really what spearheaded the beginning of this conversation and why we've gathered here today to really dive deeper into what it means to bring climate change solutions to the global world and to enact those changes. I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator today, Derek Warnick, who is the co-founder and CFO of Electric Hydrogen Co. And Derek will be moderating this session with three incredible speakers to really dive into this. So Derek, I will welcome you up now.
Thank you very much, Madison. I appreciate it and appreciate everyone taking the time to listen in today. We've got a very important topic, how we're going to advance climate solutions on a global scale. So what I'd like to do is bring three panelists up and have them introduce themselves today and provide you a little bit of context about who they are and what their companies are doing. And then we'll have a bit of a conversation that's focused on how we can advance climate solutions at a global scale. Myself, I'm the CFO at Electric Hydrogen, a company that's been very focused on advancing solutions for climate change at scale. And I was lucky enough to speak with Kate recently on the topic. So I'm going to mostly be an observer and facilitator today, and we'll take some questions at the end. So I'd ask my three panelists to please join me on video, and then we can get a little bit of an introduction from each party. So Clementine, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. Yeah, hi everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, and thanks a lot to MassChallenge for hosting this important webinar. So my name is Clementine Chambon, and I'm the co-founder and CTO of a farming services company called Urja Development Solutions. In a nutshell, we leverage solar power, so solar PV, to provide much more affordable farming services for irrigation, milling, and cooling to smallholder farmers to help them transition from diesel in favor of solar technology. And I was part of the MassChallenge Accelerator in the UK about 6 years ago now, still working on the same venture. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Govinda, if you'd like to go next.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, MassChallenge, for having me here. Hi all, I'm Govinda Upadhyay. I'm CEO founder of Smart Helio. We are also known as Doctor of Solar Plants. We believe that all the assets need to be taken care of well. So we run data analysis and help solar assets around the globe so that they can live for longer life. We believe that in future, all these energy assets will be maintained by machines. That's what we are building on, that at the end, we will remove manual intervention, all the machines will take care of the asset management, and we can squeeze out more clean energy per day from these assets. We are based out of Switzerland, but we have offices in New Delhi and in California. Thank you.
Of course, and Vikram, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you to the MassChallenge team for having me join this conversation this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you guys are. But my name is Vikram Agarwal, and I'm the director of EarthX Capital. which is the sustainability-focused innovation and investment arm of an international nonprofit called EarthX, which is actually based in Dallas, Texas, which I know some people are surprised to hear that, but we are an environmental nonprofit founded by a Texan businessman and environmentalist named Trammell Crow. And it was in 2019, one of the largest Earth Day celebrations, if not the largest Earth Day celebration in the world here in Dallas, everything from conferences, expos, and whatnot. And my team that I work with, they support the nonprofit by actually putting together an innovation summit and various programming throughout the year where we help connect investors to those in need of capital, like innovators and other investment firms. And our main event of the year is the eCapital Summit. And we are looking to collaborate more with MassChallenge since they're doing so much great work here in the United States and around the world. So thank you for having me.
Of course. So I think for our conversation here, I appreciate everyone making the introduction. You know, Vikram, maybe we'll stay with you for the first question. What has changed in the climate space over the years? Because it seems like, you know, there's been a bit of process where sometimes this is the most important thing there is, and sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's investors that are very excited about the space. Sometimes they're not. You know, where do you think we're at today, and how have things changed?
It's a really good point. I mean, so I should have said this in my background. My background was actually, I used to do emerging markets, finance and investment banking, and then I've been doing more traditional private equity. So much later stage companies. And as coming at this from a new investor into the sustainability or climate tech world, I think the big challenge you have had is that a lot of companies that have been successful, you see, right? You see the Teslas of the world and you see them on the front pages, but then there's also these other companies, unfortunately, that you also see on the front pages that haven't been successful. And part of the reason is because historically, you had a lot of capital chasing idealism. And unfortunately, they weren't actually chasing profitable businesses. So anytime there were macroeconomic or microeconomic shocks to a business or the broader industry, you had challenges. But I think a real apparent reason is, I mean, look outside what's going on around the world just this week. I mean, somebody joked about it from MassChallenge. This is one of the hottest weeks the Earth has ever had. And this isn't just impacting, you know, well-developed countries and people in cities. It's happening across the world, and especially impacting greater marginalized communities. And you see that in the United States, you've seen that around the world. And I think those significant impacts are causing a lot of other political, social strife. And because of those challenges, you have a lot more attention to these issues. And then the next thing, if there's a lot of attention, then what are the investment opportunities? But I think you've also seen a maturation of the businesses that have been in climate tech, also from both the innovator side, but also the investor side. We actually understand the technology, and these businesses are actually prepared now to move to the next level.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, you've mentioned kind of current events here with, you know, it's hotter than anything and kind of drawing attention to, you know, some of the social aspect here. You know, Clementine, maybe you'd like to comment on that, and particularly with your business having, you know, a bit of both aspects there on both the social and environmental side. You know, how have you seen the climate space more broadly, you know, change over the years as more attention may have been drawn to it?
Yeah, so first of all, just a caveat, I mean, my experience of the climate tech space is maybe the last 8 or so years, so I'm not claiming to have a view over multiple decades. I think there's definitely been a focus. So while I think the focus may have been initially more on the tech side of climate tech, so, you know, new technologies, and I think the ultimate example of that would be, you know, geoengineering startups, which I remember being, you know, a big deal maybe 10 years ago, which for me are the ultimate example of the kind of technology will save us mindset. And I feel like, so there's been two trends. One might be that, you know, of course, a lot of technologies have matured. And then like Vikram was saying, not only the technologies and the innovators, but also investors' understanding of them. But also, I think there's been more emphasis now that a lot of the technologies are mature in getting them to scale. And that requires not necessarily technology innovation and, you know, going to the lab, but actually business model innovation, which is actually where, you know, my company comes in, and many others that are actually trying to get necessary technology innovations to consumers that may have, you know, no access to them. So that's definitely been one change, this focus on, you know, not only the tech side, but also the business models. And then, of course, recognizing that, you know, climate climate issues are also social justice issues, and focusing on some of the social and other environmental outcomes that come from them. There's been a lot more investor focus on, the triple bottom line, of course. And that's also played into, what it's like to run a climate tech company. Is this, you're being, being forced to be, which is a good thing, to have a focus on all of these metrics at the same time, in addition to profitability. And then another key change, I guess, would also be, initially, we only talked about climate change mitigation, so how to reduce CO2 emissions. Of course, now climate change is definitely here, and everywhere around the world you can feel it in slightly different ways and in much more catastrophic ways in some places. But now we also have started to talk about adapting to climate change, and so there are more innovators looking at climate change adaptation as opposed to just mitigation. Although, in my opinion, I think that's still a much underinvested area.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that you kind of hit on an aspect there that we've got, in some ways, the same data that we've always had about the situation. And in some ways, we've got infinitely more data to confuse us about the situation. But then there's kind of, ability to find, I guess, a message in the noise. Govinda, maybe you could speak a bit about how you're seeing this, particularly from, I believe your company is more involved in kind of data and analytics. How is the market or climate policy or the discussion really changed, for the better or for worse over time here with perhaps more data or more confusing data?
Right. So I think if you see in the last 10 years, a lot of data has been generated, and we also became very confident on what's happening. So scientists are saying that now it's man-driven events which led to climate change, and that's much better because they have data. Technologies are getting mature because we have data now. So if you see the solar plants, we are much more confident to install a solar plant because we know it works, right? And that has really helped governments to get good policies and regulations. Like, one of the things I'm really excited about, like, apart from solar, I feel it's a much more mature technology, but the new waves of electric mobilities are coming up. And we all been talking about why, because one of the key points are data, that how people commute, what's going to happen, what is the pollution level, and technologies like storage, batteries, especially lithium ion, and other new technologies coming up. So that really helps to drive regulations. The another part of data is social media. So no one talks about. So if you say that generation Y or Z, I don't know, like, who the guy's born after 2000, right? I'm born in 1988, so that's already old, I feel. But the new guys, new kids, they really talk about climate change with Greta effect coming up, and we have this, Friday off or Friday strike thing happening. That's also driving, and politicians are thinking that, okay, if you have to survive for the next 10 years, we have to stick to people who are going to vote after 10 years. And that is also driving them to create good policies and regulation where clean tech or climate-friendly technologies can exist. So I think data side is both on the technology side, but also on the policy side, playing an extremely important role. Yeah.
Just to actually jump in on that, what Govinda just said, I think there's a really important point that with all the data that we have, it's clear to understand what are the frameworks or what are the metrics that we're using for that data. And it would be interesting to hear what others say, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges you have from the investment community or from people who aren't looking at solving these problems on a daily basis and doing the yeoman's work that Govinda, Clementine, and you, Derek, are doing. It's what are those boxes that we can put the data in, because people don't, you have to take the complex issues and you don't want to oversimplify it, but you do need to simplify it in some ways. And I think that's been one of the biggest challenges. But seeing the SEC and seeing other folks jump in, trying to provide some guardrails for this, I think will be incredibly important as the industry continues to look at investment. Because one could argue, is an oil and gas company becoming more environmentally friendly? Is that positive for the climate? Whereas some people would argue, well, you shouldn't have any oil and gas. So that's an interesting debate that I think we'll continue to have, especially in this current political and economic climate.
So, I mean, maybe that's an interesting jumping off point into the role of government or the role of regulation in what amounts to an existential threat but also potentially a large opportunity for reinvigorating job creation in certain parts of the country or parts of the world, but then also the whatever version of the Industrial Revolution this is supposed to be. I've heard this might be our fourth or something. There's maybe two that I missed, but I heard something like that. But how do you think about that? You mentioned the SEC. How do you think about the role of government or regulation in either as a help or hindrance to forward progress here?
For me, it's interesting. So this is a very Texas perspective, and I know we have a reputation, but the truth is, you need to have regulation, you need to have policies, but I think it can't be done in a silo. And a lot of times you have a lot of policies or regulation are being done from a political standpoint, that's not necessarily from an economic or really an investment standpoint or promoting innovation. I think where you see the opportunities for policies or regulation is to provide some comfort, because investors, and I'm sure you guys could all echo this as innovators, you need to have some certainty before you move forward, before you jump in the pool, right? And I think that's kind of the role that government regulation can have, and also protecting different folks. But I think it shouldn't be done in a way that stymies broader collaboration and broader solutions, which is sometimes, unfortunately, you do see this overregulation based on political needs versus based on actually trying to solve a problem. And I think the more they can get different people and you can have a holistic solution for both the private sector, NGOs, public, and policymakers, plus with innovators, I think when you get that combination, you actually can find regulation that actually supports from the investment and innovation side.
So, Govinda, do you feel that regulation is potentially a positive thing? Are you worried about this as a threat to your business, as an opportunity to take some more structure behind something that historically has been less structured? How do you think about it?
I think regulation is good. It depends how far you want to go with that, but depends, regulation is good in the sense that if it is driving the business, driving innovation, why not? I can give you an example of Switzerland. We decided to switch off nuclear after this tsunami, Fukushima happened. People were okay with that. They were okay, hey, we should switch off nuclear. Still, in Switzerland, we believe that our emission is very low because most of the things are either nuclear or hydro, and they're kind of phasing out nuclear. But after Ukraine and Russia war, a lot of regulations came in, and then people said, hey, no, it's okay that we can reduce our consumption, and let's try to generate more clean energy. And regulation came that now houses which are exposed to sun, they need to have solar panels. And these solar panels are expensive. Still, people believe that they are expensive assets. Oh, I don't understand it. But suddenly, government made these regulations. Of course, they are creating more subsidies and all those tech-friendly environments, financing. And the people are willing to do that now. That, hey, it makes sense. Climate is bad. Everything is heating up. And then the war. I don't want oil from that. So this is one example. There are multiple examples like that where regulations are helping people at household level to think about the consequences and think about that, hey, I have to live for future. I need to go green. Another example, and which is beautiful, over the last couple of years, I have seen more and more organic and fair food kind of thing happening, and green vegetables and all coming to supermarket. And more people are buying that, even though these tend to be 10 to 20% more expensive compared to other ones. And that just shows the tendency that, okay, people are moving towards that. And now the government is also pushing. I know in France, they said that you can't throw away the food anymore, right? You have to give it to, by regulation, you have to give it to organizations. These are good. These are really good. And I'm truly a believer that government should make more such policies to push people faster towards that.
So those policies, by and large, are likely positive. But you brought up a great point there that sometimes policies and regulation create a disparity in costs that may raise prices, or in some cases decrease access. So, as we think about the necessary technology and some of these innovations, I think the concept of equitable access is something that's really worth digging in on. if things are going to be 10 times as expensive, does that deprive a subset of the global community from an opportunity to really access this? So Clementine, how do you think about the barriers that might exist to equitable access to climate tech in general, and how might we better address this going forward?
Sure, no, I'll be happy to answer that. So, of course, when we talk about climate tech, we already said, there's a huge gap to address in terms of the global pathway that we have to take, but there's a totally different set of needs that we have to consider as well when we think about the fact that, many of us, a significant proportion, somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people on the planet, still don't have access to, basic services, whether it's, electricity or healthcare or education. So we can't disentangle those needs from the fact that we have to decarbonize, for example. And again, I don't think that climate tech is by all, the silver bullet that is going to help us get out of the mess that we've created. But I do think that we need to think more about the systems that we've built and how to either dismantle them or, adapt them so that we can make them more equitable. So the first point is that through my experience, unless you actually have an innovation, whether it's a technology or a business model or a combination, unless that technology or innovation specifically targets the last mile consumer, so whether they're low income or disadvantaged for another reason, it simply won't reach them. And I think that a lot of, in my experience, again, investors are kidding themselves that they want to build an impact-driven company, and they want it to reach the last mile, but they also want it to be as profitable as some of their other ventures most of the time. And unless they're, the end user is specifically targeted, then again, the access just is simply not reached. So one challenge is, of course, that, when we talk about, especially in the global south, which I forgot to mention, by the way, that my company is only operating and focused on rural India. So we work with low income farmers in rural India. So the kind of consumers that we work with, they're remote or rural. I would say they're dispersed. I mean, that's not really a challenge in rural India. The population density is very high, but you have a lot of consumers in African countries, for example, that are also smallholder farmers, and they're much more dispersed, so more difficult to target. And of course, they're low income. And that means that they face a lot of barriers to accessing climate tech. So one obvious one is the financial barrier. Even if they can save money over the longer term by accessing, the climate innovation. So in our case, it would be solar power versus diesel power. It's much cheaper over the long run, but there might be an upfront cost barrier. There might be another barrier that prevents them from accessing financing to even be able to, make that saving. So they're trapped basically in the more expensive, service or solution. Then of course there's awareness. So actually in my experience, even low income farmers who have not had any formal education, they're still aware of climate change. They know what it is and they know that it's changing their livelihoods, but they're not able to, use that information to do something about it and help themselves get out of the situation. So yeah, awareness is definitely another major challenge. And I think another problem that we rarely talk about is the fact that those of us who are either designing or developing or financing climate tech innovations, we're not really representative. Well, I'll speak for myself at least. We're not representative of the communities that are actually impacted by climate change. And that's millions of people today. So I think we also need better representation of the people in the room who are designing the solutions and have lived experience of them. And that would help not just for more inclusiveness, but also actually for scalability, because then you'd be able to design solutions that can scale and then address the problem. So I think those are some of the challenges to do with the nature of the end consumers who are totally missed out, the way we design solutions, and then of course other market barriers that make it difficult to access some populations.
I think those are really great points, and maybe I'll stay with you here and hit on a point that you've made, particularly in the financial aspect of how these innovations and solutions are financed and who's making the decisions about their finance and about how equitable access and where the money comes from for some of these things are really tied together. So when you think about the climate tech investors, where do you see their role evolving to, or where it's been historically, as there's probably a subset, and I'll come to Vikram here in a moment to take maybe a little bit more of the technology in US focus, but Clementine, how do you see the role of the investor both as it pertains to equitable access, but also broad access. Almost none of these solutions are going to be very meaningful if they're deployed in one country or one sub-market. They need to be deployed broadly and inherently have some equitability there or equality to that. How do you think about that?
Well, briefly, I guess, ultimately, of course, as an innovator, you rely on investors to get your solutions to scale. And that means the investors have to understand the need. That's a critical point, right? So knowing what the need is for a different innovation and making sure that it's actually based on a critical, need, as opposed to just because, a technology is sexy, we want to get it out into the world. So I think there's some, I guess in partnership with investors, it's important to inform ourselves about what those needs really are, first of all. Then I guess it's about the type of finance that's made available. So of course, depending on the type of innovation, some might be super profitable, scalable based on software, for example, and then, they can reach millions of users pretty quickly. Other innovations, such as what I work in, which is infrastructure, ultimately, it's more difficult to scale. It's not going to scale exponentially, and it requires, patient capital, blended finance as well. So different instruments needed for different contexts. And I think, having a wider availability of especially patient capital would be helpful in terms of scaling some of that critical infrastructure. But, ultimately, I think there's already been a lot of progress in that. And I've, even in the last 5-6 years, I felt that there's potentially less investor focus on just technology for the sake of technology, and more focus on, also business model innovation and recognizing that as a critical tool to actually get technology out there. I'm basing that on personal experience of, a lot of investors actually coming back and saying, hey, initially we weren't really looking at this space, but now we've realized that we really need business models like yours to sort of get this technology out there. So I think that's a positive thing, but, of course, we still have some way to go.
Vikram, do you see these new business models from an investor perspective as being useful to both deploy capital to companies that are seeking it, but also, as Clementine mentioned, make sure that capital is flowing down to the right level of use in order to be helpful?
Yeah, I think Clementine, she makes amazing points so she's literally boots on the ground solving these challenges. And I think there's a couple of different points I wanted to touch on that. And I know a lot of the audience is innovators. So as an innovator, when you're looking at an investor, it's trying to figure out what's their priorities, what's their model, what's their return hurdle, what's their hold period. Are they looking for a 3 to 5 year return, which later stage investors are looking for? Or are they willing to hold on to a business for 7 to 10 years? And I think that's one of the challenges that some traditional investors have, is that when they came into VC, or when you had the clean tech bubble back in, unfortunately, 10 plus years ago, I think it was around $25 billion was invested and around half of it was lost, according to PwC. That left a lot of scars for a lot of folks. So I think it's understanding what are the businesses that are going to both drive whatever their goals are, if it's impact, if it's financial returns, if it's impact from an environmental standpoint, from a people standpoint. So that's one. But then it's second, it's also realizing that you don't always need these sexy technologies that are solving basic problems to access for resources that, hey, I take for granted here in the United States, or especially in Dallas. But people across the world, as Clementine mentioned, that don't even have basic access to food, water, or electricity. You sometimes are looking for the basic blocking and tackling. If it's business innovation that's going to drive a return, but also great impact, that's great. But the other point I think she mentions that's incredibly important is that blended finance model. And I think you're going to need different forms of capital, either if it's public sector capital, if it's going to be nonprofit or philanthropy, or if it's going to be pure private driven, which if you bring in all that other sources of capital, actually juices or increases your returns as a private sector investor. And I think you need a combination of all of that. And my only fear is if we do have an economic recession like we have in the United States, and what's going on with the economic uncertainty around the world, will that capital, that private sector capital, pull back if they don't feel like they're actually investing in businesses that they feel like they're going to get a return or they're going to do well. So I think the more that we can support those types of entrepreneurs who actually solve these problems and help them scale, I think we'll go a long way.
So you brought up an interesting point about scale, right? And how capital is something that can allow technology potentially to reach a scale that's meaningful. But I think as we've all learned, and in this conversation it's been made more clear, the solutions that are being deployed themselves have to be able to scale, regardless of how much money you put behind something. That's something that you can't change, whether or not your solution is able to scale. So Govind, maybe you can provide a little bit of context about what that means and how you think about the scale that's necessary to be impactful. I know that there's great institutions out there. I'd say one of, a company that, or a venture group that I was previously at, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, Gates and Bezos, Clean Tech Venture Shop, has an overt target that they require a 0.5 gigaton of annual emissions reduction, which is approximately 1% of global emissions in 2050. That's the scale metric that they use. How do you think about scale, and does it have to be that big, or does it need to be bigger, or how does that really fit together in a coherent plan for a solution?
Derek, no, it's a really good question. So I was just running around some stats, and I realized that we always had nonprofit money since the beginning, right? Philanthropy money, government grants, there are corporate sustainability funds. They were always funding this. And in my previous company, also we were part of that social enterprise. We were getting a lot of the social grants to run this, but it was impossible to make it on scale, because these guys, they come with a small budget. They say, hey, I can just give you, I don't know, 100 grand or 1 million, that's it, and stop bothering me. As soon as the private equity has moved and like private money has come through VC, private equities and all this things have started scaling up. Like Tesla is one of the big examples, right? So they were able to go at a scale. So last year, a little less than 100 billion has come from private fundings to the clean tech. That is 210% increase happened from the previous year. Again, there are funding agencies who will just pop up in last 2-3 years. Breakthrough Energy you talked about, there's collaborative funds, they're low carbon, they're on silicon based guys really pushing harder on these aspects. And I think like we need some key performers, both on the investor side as well as technology side, which kind of drives the other guys. So I've seen that other investors in Silicon Valley just tag along with these guys and say, hey, we don't understand how this whole thing works, but I know you guys are smart guys. I just want to follow up the investments with you. And suddenly you have companies raising like billions on that. So we have a great company like Climework, which gets carbon from the atmosphere. They've been existing for 10 years, okay? No one cared about them, literally no one. In the last couple of years, they got investments. Suddenly the carbon, like sucking out of carbon from atmosphere became super sexy. And they poured in and they became unicorn in the last 2 years. They started making big machines. They start with Iceland right now, which can absorb like around gigatons of carbon from that. Again, just because some people put faith in such technologies and then other people just followed up and say, okay, we have to deploy in the large scale. And large scale only happen when the private money comes in from the investors and equity, private equity funds. So I believe that has started happening. It's still not there just because of one thing. So why it's happening? Because there's a 200% increase in the funding. That's great. But if you see in terms of unicorns in climate tech, so it means that these are the companies who can deploy at larger scale. They just are 10%. Sorry, actually 7% unicorns in the world right now based on our clean tech. So there are around 1,000 unicorns right now. And that's the one indicator made me feel that, hey, like we need to catch up a lot. Like climate is one of the biggest challenge of this generation. But why it is only 7%? Can you make it to 30% or 40% of unicorns? Okay, unicorns still just a number, but just I'm using as a metric that how these companies will deploy the solution at scale. There are two aspects on that, one scale in developed world and one scale in emerging world. I'm not sure with the emerging world how this will happen yet, because there are a lot of things are happening, but still not at the last mile where Clementine and Urja works with. And I believe that once we start doing that, that will be the real change. That will be the scale we'll have. Because those people, they don't want Teslas, to be honest. They don't want Teslas. They don't want SpaceX or anything happening there, right? Still, this is important. I don't deny that, because a lot of technologies will come. but we will leave billions of people. That's the scale I'm talking about. And that can come if you show some profitable business, but we are not yet there.
That's great, Govinda. And maybe that is a good prompt for Clementine there when we're talking about the capital that's coming in and talking about how there's a pretty big difference between sexy technology in Switzerland that is going to be deployed, where you can go and look at it and say, here's this, $100 million magic box. That's something that people can get excited about, do a press release about it. How that the impact that could have is certainly global, but there's a lot of individuals that have, I guess, more complex situations that need to be solved where there isn't a magic box. How do you think about the challenges to really reaching a global scale, particularly in emerging markets or less technically developed spaces, and that being a viable solution for private investors to be able to realize the returns that they need to kind of empower that scale?
Okay, that's a big set of questions there, but I do have some thoughts. So this kind of comes back to some of our earlier discussion about government policy in a way. So again, I can actually have two examples. One is from the emerging markets context, specifically related to my work in India, but the other could also be applied to more developed economy like the US. So when you talk about the kind of innovation that we're at Wuja that we've been promoting in India, so ultimately, I mean, yeah, the ideal would be, because it's a new business model and a demonstrated technology, the risk is, of course, in convincing millions of low-income consumers to buy into this business model and become, being able to scale the operations to a significant extent. So of course, there are significant risks in there for an investor, but also, enormous business opportunity if you can actually make that business work. But ultimately, so of course you would need private investment, but also I think public investment, like we were talking about blended finance, to make that happen. But ultimately, for me, one good outcome, and this may be maybe a bit of a turn off for the investors in the room, including you, Vikram, but one ultimate outcome would be that you've demonstrated this business model, you've shown that it can work, and then the government themselves decide that they want to pick up and take over and scale it, from maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of people to millions of people, which you as one individual company, trying to solve this problem would not be able to achieve. So I think there's something to be said for, let's be realistic, an individual company or even a company working in partnership with other stakeholders is unlikely to, reach the 0.5 gigaton or so per year. 0.5 gigaton is absolutely huge. I mean, if you think about the fact that the world's annual emissions are something like, I think, 35 or so gigatons. So, that's 1/70th of the problem already solved. Not saying don't be ambitious, but I'm saying be realistic and also bear in mind the timeline. So we could maybe reach that level, but it would take us, decades, whereas the climate crisis is here and now, and we need to start making a dent, much more quickly. So I think one strategy in an emerging market could be that you demonstrate, you build up enough traction that the government says, hey, actually, this innovation is pretty good value for money. And I would actually like to, we would like to actually take part in scaling it. And then I also think there's something to be said for, again, you'll see that I'm a big believer in good government policy. Just to give another example from a non-emerging market, so in the US, I think one, for me, leading example of how climate tech should work is actually a company called Block Power that some of you might know about. So they're basically working on greening buildings. And I think the way they do that is really cool because they use technology. So they have these proprietary algorithms that they use to decide what type of efficient heating and cooling systems you should implement in a building. And they mostly retrofit buildings in disadvantaged communities where they have absolutely sky-high energy costs and also very polluting, bad for indoor air pollution and people's health, and of course, bad for their wallets. So they use the technology. They have structured finance, so they have different financiers on board, including Goldman Sachs, for example, and though they actually provide the finance for that infrastructure. And then even more clever, the ultimate stakeholder, they partner with government, so they partner with municipalities, and those municipalities tell them, go and electrify all of the buildings in this city or part of the city. So they're basically connecting the government, the utilities, the people who own the buildings, the equipment providers, and they're making all that happen. So if we can tap into those kind of models, then it becomes ultra scalable, and then we can actually reach those 0.5 gigatons or gigatons. but yeah, I think we need to have more examples of successful climate tech innovations like this that are both inclusive but also profitable and have actually managed to build a solution that can scale.
Well, it's certainly an interesting take on the way things could progress into the future, and that maybe there's a role for private industry to take something so far, and then perhaps the government to of wherever to step in and lend a hand. Vikram, is that how you see the future playing out here over the next 5 to 10 years, or what direction do you anticipate is most likely for this to go?
I think we need more Clementine, Govindas, and Derek's in the world, and I think we have them, and I think that's the audience. And I think they both bring up a really good point: is you need these holistic solutions, right? I think you can't do it in a silo. You need to bring different stakeholders. I think it's important. I meet a lot of innovators through our event that we do through EarthX, and unfortunately, a lot of the companies they're trying to solve an aspirational problem, but they have to remember what's the direct problem they're trying to solve for both their direct or indirect customer. And I think as you see businesses either deploying really innovative technology or basic technology, you're going to need this holistic solution. And I think you're going to see that going forward. And I think you're going to see a lot more collaboration between different organizations. I think you're going to see a lot more best practices beyond from one region to another region. And I think it's going to be important because I think you're going to have interesting debates. I mean, even here in the United States, there's people who can't afford a lot of the technologies that we know will solve problems. We can't even afford them in the United States. We have a higher income and higher savings rate. How do you expect people in the emerging markets to do it? And I think that's another interesting point, is they're going to see the benefit of both public sector capital. So Clementine mentioned how you have that here I know Block Power is doing a lot in New York City and in New York, but how do you take that same concept to emerging markets? So you see the United States government with the DFC trying to support various projects, but they're trying to find those innovators. And I think that's a significant pool of capital. And when you look forward, it will be interesting to see as the public markets. So Govinda had mentioned how private equity has matured and has adopted a lot more investment in climate tech related businesses. I think if you can somehow overcome the greenwashing and some of the ESG noise, and you really actually focus on particular solutions that are solving problems, either for businesses, people, communities, whatever those problems are. If you can figure out how to solve those, I think the public markets will start adopting it. And you saw it with the interest of SPACs. Now, unfortunately, you had a lot of companies that were going public that weren't actually ready to go public, or they weren't profitable, or they hadn't defined their product yet. And I think it's the same thing that the venture community went through probably, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. But eventually, once you have that maturation of the capital markets, that will help support the private investors, and hopefully those private investors with the blended finance models can support the different innovators, but understanding that not all investors the same, not all innovators the same. So really understanding what the problem you're trying to solve for and who's the right partner for you.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And Govinda, maybe we'll get your take on what the future may hold for us quickly, and then we've got a couple questions here from the audience, and so then maybe we'll handle those and take any more. If anyone else has any questions, please go ahead and pose those. But Govinda, where are we heading 5 to 10 years in the future? What's it look like?
I think I feel that people will be more involved compared to our generation. I'm a big fan of bottom-up approach. So a lot of these kids who are going to start voting, they'll play an important role, definitely. And that will push government and the public sector to move towards what matters to people. Right now in our generation, maybe it might not matter so much yet. Generation like maybe my generation, but if I see my parents and other people, still they're not yet there in the thought process, the way we look at the climate change or clean tech. But when we become parents, and then, so that's definitely, I'm seeing great, this is good, this is good for us. Second part, a lot of technologies, what we are working right now will get mature. Solar has matured, EVs are getting better and better. We have new storage, much more sustainable storage is coming. Hydrogen is coming up. A lot of money is poured in on that, good stuff. I'm a big believer of hydrogen actually, and I believe that that will really get us there. You know, like good to have solar, good to have batteries, good to have wind, but they cannot give me the same sense of energy, what we need to really transition fast, right? So that will get maturer, we'll have much more understanding, so that's good. The third part is the money, financing. that will be much more better because people understand technologies and they know that, okay, I can get this much of ROI with this kind of venture. That's okay. I'm able to put the money on that part. Just one of the important aspect one I was looking into, pension funds have come now. They're putting a lot of money in solar assets, wind. When the pension funds start putting money, I think that's signs that, okay, because that's really the look for long term, right? And it's the people's money, really. I'm seeing more and more these pension funds are pouring in money for these clean tech thing, which is much more riskier than any other assets. That's a good indication for us. And I believe that such money will also flow in future. So I'm very positive. I'm excited. I'm really looking forward for new things. Every year I'm tracking new stuff happening. All the folks here, we have been working for the last 10 years in this sector on various things from research to startups and working for companies. And it is great. It is great. Like, and it's getting better and better. So yeah, I'm excited.
I think that's true. I think I've never been more excited and never been more scared. I think at the same time, there's a lot that's happening in the world, and I think, you know, what we're hearing more and more recently is a lot of kind of dark and scary potential, but then a lot of opportunity to do good. And so I think what we can do now is maybe take some questions that have come in from the audience. And what we'll do with these is I'll kind of just toss them up without prompts, and any of the three of our panelists, please feel free to jump in, and be respectfully, right, of course, and jump in and provide an answer. But one of the questions I think that ties into what we've been talking about here recently is this intersection of raising capital and then doing something positive for the environment, and then somehow that has to make money. So we've talked a lot about getting investors to invest in a space so that they can realize a return because they've invested in a profitable company. But how is it that someone should really efficiently think about linking a business model to environmental change or GHG reduction? How can that be measured, and how do you go about thinking about that business model aspect, particularly of doing something right now that in many parts of the world, there may not be an overt market for the service you're providing if it's an environmental reduction and whatnot. What's a way to combine those?
I'm going to jump in. I'll do the easy. For me, it's an easy answer, right? Making money and making the world better are not mutually exclusive. Helping people, helping businesses, helping communities from an environmental standpoint, from either giving them access to resources or giving them access to risk mitigation, whatever that is. You can make money, but you can also make the world better. It's just figuring out what is that sweet spot. I know I keep harping on this, but what is it? It's the term that we use when I'm looking at investments or I'm looking at companies. It's called a strategic value proposition. Do you have a reason to exist? And if you can show that you have a reasoning to exist, if there's ever a macroeconomic shock or a microeconomic shock, and that reason to exist is you're helping in the built environment, to Clementine's point, Block Power is helping businesses and both their direct customer and their indirect customer save money and have other long-term benefits and have an impact. If you can find that sweet spot and figure out ways that you can improve other people's outcomes, you're going to be a long-lasting business. That's what I joke and I call it sustainability. You're going to be a sustainable business and you're actually solving a sustainable problem. I think it's much easier than people realize. You just have to take the step back and think about what are you actually trying to solve for and other ways to link it. With data and metrics like Smart Helio can do, obviously.
Anyone else on business models, ways to think about making them work?
Yeah, I have some thoughts here. So yeah, I mean, I think obviously Vikram kind of provided more like the investor perspective. So from an innovator perspective, I would say the starting point should always be the need or the demand of the consumer, right? So there's virtually no point in scaling a technology just because technology is cool. And yes, I know that, of course, many technologies, you don't know how they're going to be applied and you have to first explore that. But let's say you have a technology, you know it's mature enough and you want to scale it. So figure out the need. I think a lot of companies might skip this step or do it a little bit too quickly. But I think you need to spend a lot of time with the user, the customer, and understand what their actual need is, how much they're willing to pay, what their alternatives are, and build that strategic value proposition by actually talking to the consumer before you start figuring out what the best business model is. And there may not be an obvious best fit business model. You may have to try multiple different business models. And of course, learning from others to see what business models have failed. So those are some important stories that, we need to share with each other so that we can learn faster. Again, time is always of the essence, right? When you talk about scaling something climate related. And then again, once you have the right, some initial traction, I think then is the time to actually find who would be the best partners to work with. So whether those are investors and figuring out what type of investors, and again, specifically looking at what type of finance and the time window over which an investor wants to make a return. And of course, what their ultimate goals are. And that will, obviously those have to be aligned so that both the company or the innovator and the investor can agree on what would be some metrics to measure the performance of the company. And those would be a combination of both some, key performance indicators, like, your traditional things like number of customers you have, your revenues, etc. And then some more non-traditional metrics like, your CO2 savings or number of low-income people that you've reached, for example. So that would be the order that I would approach this. Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. And I think we've talked a lot about here about, making money and about how investors and companies need to find ways to make money in order for them to be financially sustainable and whatnot. There is a path to be doing the right thing through charitable works, but those pools of capital are certainly defined. In the spirit of making money doing the right thing, there's kind of a dark side to this too, and this is our next question from the audience is greenwashing, which is the concept of all of a sudden now, I've recently read about responsibly sourced natural gas is now a thing where there's a label you can put on the same dead dinosaurs you pumped out of the ground, but they did a good job planting trees next to the gas pipeline or something. I don't know what responsibly sourced natural gas is, but there are these opportunities where people are trying to just make more money by saying they're doing the right thing. So is greenwashing really a problem? How can companies or investors work together to validate that what's happening is real and true and not just corporate spin in order to do the right green thing for their wallet?
The joke I make, Derek, is I used to make the joke, they say, you ask 5 different people in a room what sustainability means, you get 10 different responses, right? Even the person who's answering it, even if you ask me in the beginning of the conversation and the end, it will change. And I think what will be important is understanding how do you define it? So to your point, responsibly sourced natural gas, how do you define what that is? And what are the metrics? So what are the parameters around it? That's where I think you do need some government regulation. You need policies, right? You need some buy-in from the overall business community, whoever the folks are, because otherwise people are just going to start throwing terms. And I think you see it. I mean, if you look at this ESG funds, right? If you look at all the funds that are quote unquote ESG, you start looking at their holdings. Most of those companies aren't the most ESG focused. Now, I'm not going to name any of those businesses, but those are not the ones that I would say are the real leaders for the environment or sustainability. That's how I view it. Obviously, social issues are important. So I think that is the biggest challenge. And I think without those metrics and without those guidelines, and there is a race to that right now, which is going to cause even more issues because you're going to have people competing against each other with their own agendas.
I think I just want to give a quick comment. I think the regulation will play a very important role in greenwashing because the definitions and the constraints will be clear. What is good, what is bad. And if the regulation comes in with good policies, and we are moving towards that, right? If someone is saying that natural gas is green, I think it's better than saying long back the coal is green. Now we can have a green coal. Like there was 5 years back, there was something called green coal, and I never understood what the hell is a green coal. But that was the thing, and now at least no one talks about it.
Well, it was a plant 300 million years ago, so clean enough, right?
Right. So exactly, the regulations will come in and will do it, and I hope that the government will keep doing in this direction, like defining the definition, so that the big corporates don't start doing, lobbying for PR for bad things. They should do PR for good things.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a little off topic now, right? But obviously here we're talking more about the tactics that the incumbent, the big polluters, for example, or the companies that are actually responsible for the climate crisis, they still use the same tactics that, they've been using for decades and that tobacco companies also use, right? In terms of pretending, first they pretended they didn't know about the problem. Now they generate all this fake evidence to pretend, to make it seem like it's less important. And the third and final strategy is pretending like they're part of the solution. I mean, how do you overcome that when they have still such deep pockets and they're so like they've managed to brainwash a significant part of the population? I think then you're talking more about, since we were talking about young people and getting more innovators involved, I think it really starts there. And like Govinda was saying, I think fortunately a lot of the younger generations are super tapped into, everything from vested interests to, the greenwashing tactics that are used.
Absolutely.
And we need to keep the upper hand by being more educated than them and inform ourselves so that we can spot when something is a lie. But I think expecting government to do that for us and regulate, this problem out of existence is also unrealistic, because a lot of governments themselves stand to profit from, the fact that they have close links to the fossil fuel industry, for example. So I think we need to do that.
Let's
job
hope
for
that
ourselves.
our conversation today provided some of that education and insight. I really appreciate the three of you taking some time to speak with me, and I hope this encourages everyone that took the time to listen to go out there and figure out how they can create solutions to this problem.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Derek, Govinda, Clementine, Vikram. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. I think, Derek, you said it best. I've never been more excited or more scared. I think we've explored so much in this panel about all of the opportunities that are available, and really to make a difference, it has to be on a global scale. And we thank you for everyone who is working in that space, for everyone who joined in today to engage in the conversation and learn from these brilliant global minds. We appreciate you all coming, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. We'll definitely make this recording available to anyone who missed it or would like to catch up again and revisit the conversation. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Have a great one.
Thanks, everybody.